We kicked off our series on 100 plus modern masterpieces guaranteed to improve your chess with the first step in every chess game: control the center. In this video, we are looking at step 2, develop your pieces. There is a reason for this order. Unless you have some stake in the center, it is very, very hard to develop your pieces, and you don't know where to develop them. For example, imagine that white starts the game with all pawns on the 4th rank. You might think that this would be complicated. White has space, but there must be weak squares and king safety issues that come with having all of your pawns advanced, right? In fact, engines show that this position is just winning for white. White controls so much space that black will simply never be able to develop properly. So, start your game by grabbing a stake in the center with your pawns. Then develop your pieces based on the central structure. Here are 5 tips to help you develop in your games. First, develop knights before bishops. Yes, this rule is very old and has many exceptions, but it will still aid beginners in many cases. The knights want to go to f3, f6, c3, and c6, while the bishops may pick many good squares to develop too, based on what your opponent does. So, if you are unsure what to do, developing your knights first is often a good idea. Second, develop the pieces in the direction that you are going to castle first. Again, there are many exceptions, but a lot of players have been torched in the opening because they developed the queen side before clearing the path to castle kingside. We'll see that in today's game. Whether castling kingside or queenside, make clearing the pieces to ready castling a priority. Third, castling is a developing move. Yes, you need to castle to make your king safe, but you also need to castle to connect your rooks. Don't forget to take a breath to do that and bring all of your pieces to the party. Fourth, don't forget the heavy pieces. Many new players bring out the minor pieces, castle, and then immediately start attacking. The rooks and the queen are incredibly powerful. If you include them in the action quickly, you will often be rewarded. Today's game demonstrates all of these ideas as the talented Filipino star Wesley So takes down the legendary Garry Kasparov in what has been called one of the greatest blitz chess games of all time. The game recalls Paul Morphy's classic opera game, and it demonstrates many of the same principles of development. But while Morphy was eviscerating amateur nobility, so did this against arguably the greatest player to ever play the game of chess. So opens the game here with knight to f3. Now, this might not seem like an aggressive move, and at the amateur level, it often isn't. White will often play this to avoid theory or to avoid confrontation early in the opening. But at the top level, this move still allows white to go back to a lot of other openings that are very aggressive, and white is kind of waiting to see what black plays, and Kasparov plays pawn to g6, and so immediately does go back to the most aggressive option with pawn to e4. At this point, we're in a modern defense, an opening that's not considered necessarily the best for black at the top level, and it's probably something that Kasparov wasn't really eager to play. After pawn to e4, we see bishop g7, d4, d6, and now So doesn't exactly stay in the modern defense, which would happen typically if the knight came to c3, either here or a little bit later. Instead, he plays pawn to c4. Now, this allows Kasparov to play in the style of the King's Indian defense, which he can do with knight to f6, intending to castle and play pawn to e5. This is an opening he has played countless times in his career, but for some reason, in this particular case, he mixes it up. He plays bishop to g4. Now, the engine actually approves of this move, and depending on what engine you're looking at and what the depth is, in some cases, the engine says that this move is best. But I think this actually gets Kasparov in a little bit of trouble, and the reason is you probably don't want to exchange this bishop, and you're developing the queen side and not the king side on which you need to castle. So there's going to come a critical point where this move needs to be followed up precisely, and we'll see that soon. And if it's not followed up precisely, being out here actually creates some problems for this bishop. So After bishop to g4, we see bishop to e2, knight to c6, putting a lot of pressure right here on this pawn on d4, of course. Simple idea. Capture on f3, then capture on d4. Of course, So is not going to allow that, and he plays knight to d2. So if Kasparov were to capture on f3, then he could just take back with the knight right here and defend d4. Now, in this position, the key move, according to the computer, is knight to f6, developing and getting ready to castle very soon. If Kasparov does this, then the computer says the position is sound for black. Now, white is still a little bit better, but this is a playable option. Instead, Kasparov plays pawn to e5, trying to get a King's Indian defense position, where the position locks up after d5, and eventually black plays pawn to f5. In this case, though, we're going to see that there are some problems. A key element of the King's Indian, which we don't have quite the traditional structure for here, is that the position is truly blocked, allowing black to neglect development a little bit because there's no hope of pawn breaks in the middle of the board. That is not the case here. So after pawn e5, So pushes forward with d5, kicking this knight back. In this position, Kasparov plays knight c to e7, and I think this is a little bit dubious. Now, a lot of amateur players want to keep the knight in the center of the board. I've just developed the knight. I want to keep it in the middle, but on e7, the knight gets a little bit in the way of this knight here on g8, and instead, it might have been better to pull the knight back to b8 and then redevelop it later to d7. It's a small difference, though. Basically, by playing the knight to e7, what Kasparov wants to do is play pawn to f5. Then this knight can come to f6, and then he can castle. At that point, he would have a great King's Indian defense position. The problem is he is behind on development, and he needs a lot of moves to make this happen. He's trying to get all possible good things to happen, and there's just not enough time. So, after knight c to e7, a great move from So. Pawn to h3, asking this bishop on g4, what do you want to do? And unfortunately, the bishop doesn't have a great answer. If it captures on f3, which feels like the right move, after all, black is down in space. When you're down in space, you often want to trade pieces so that your position feels less cramped, less crowded. After bishop takes f3, knight takes f3, the move that Kasparov really wants to play now or soon is pawn to f5, but it just doesn't work because you don't have the light-squared bishop. Knight to g5, the knight is going to e6. Don't you wish you had a bishop on c8? And when the knight comes to e6, it is just a dominant and winning position for white. Additionally, if the bishop is exchanged, then a lot of times the attack from black on the king side loses its power. So it might seem like a good idea to exchange the bishop, but it often isn't, which is why Kasparov retreats the bishop to d7. Now, after bishop d7, if we can just get a little bit of time for black and go ahead and play pawn to f5, develop our last minor piece, castle, things will be grand. And of course, that is what Kasparov is hoping for. But So appreciates that he has a lead in development, the position is not yet closed, and so he strikes. Pawn to c5. This is a great move. Easily missed. Suddenly, there are a lot of problems for black on d6, and the knight on d2, which seemed not to be very well developed, is headed to an amazing square on c4. At this point, Kasparov realizes this is going to be a problem and he cannot continue with his plans. He quickly goes ahead and captures the pawn. There was no particularly good choice, so at least he has a pawn in pocket. Now, after pawn takes c5, we get knight c4, 2 threats. The first threat is simply to capture on e5, and the second is to play pawn to d6, ripping open the middle of the board. Yes, black is a pawn up, but these are major issues. At this point, we get pawn to f6. This is the best move in the position, objectively, according to the engine. You must hold on to the pawn on e5, but at the same time, this is a very sad move to play. After f6, you have here no good hope for this bishop here on g7, and the knight cannot go to f6. Additionally, you've weakened your light squares, and black is going to feel that very, very soon. So after pawn to f6, we get pawn to d6, the most natural move from So, and unfortunately, this is not the right move. It is the only mistake that So makes in this game. After pawn d6, we'll see why Kasparov had one way to defend the position and get to equality. Instead, what So should have done is developed his last minor piece, bishop e3. Then, after Kasparov defends this pawn on c5, pawn to b6, we see b4, a move that we'll see later on, ripping open the position, pawn takes b4, d6. This is similar to lines we'll see in the game, but it doesn't allow Kasparov any of the defensive chances he's going to get. Now, in this position, Kasparov desperately needed to play pawn takes d6. The critical point is that after knight takes d6 check, knight takes d6, trading off that massive knight that was on c4, queen takes d6, there is the move queen to b6. This move doesn't exist in the other line that we looked at and in various lines that we're going to see in the game because there's going to be a pawn on b6. But here, offering the queen trade allows Kasparov just enough time to defend the position. Now, at this point, So can either retreat the queen and try to play on for some compensation, which is possible, or go ahead and capture on c5, regaining the pawn, but giving up the attack. Kasparov would have incredibly equalized. Also, we should point out that after pawn takes d6, if So wants, b4 is an interesting pawn sacrifice. Now, the engine says that black is a little bit better after this very aggressive move, but I think a lot of human players playing a blitz game would still be very inclined to go for this line. In the game, though, Kasparov plays pawn to b6. At this point, So has a massive advantage, and it's probably too much to say that this is the decisive mistake, but from here on, Kasparov is not going to get really any good chance to save the game. First off, we get castles. This is very much in line with our tips in the beginning of the game. So is patient. He takes time out to castle, and this is not a move that is only patient. It is a developing move. The rook is now able to come into the game, and that is going to be a force. When you're attacking, sometimes you only look at moves that attack with the pieces that you already have out. Don't forget to bring your rooks and your queen into the game. Get everyone included. That temporary breath allows you to deliver the fatal knockout punch. So, after castles, we get bishop to c6. At this point, the last move for Kasparov was again to capture on d6 and play this position, but this is much worse than the line he could have had because there's no queen b6 in this case. So bishop c6, So plays pawn takes c7. At this point, I think that a lot of amateur players would want to trade queens, saying, oh my goodness, my king is in the middle of the board. I haven't castled. I'm behind on development. I'm under attack. Let me trade queens. But in a lot of cases, trading queens doesn't really offer salvation. It doesn't here either. After rook takes d1, just because the queens are off the board doesn't mean black is safe. Now material's equal. This passed pawn is one square away from promotion, and white still has a massive lead in development. The rook d8 threat check is huge. Here's one line that I really like. Knight to e7, rook d8 check, king f7, and then the very pretty knight c takes e5 check. This move allows the bishop then to come to c4 with check, and after king to f6, it's bishop g5 with a beautiful checkmate. So this is one possible line. The key point is that trading queens doesn't save Kasparov. So he goes ahead and recaptures on c7. At this point, So strikes with pawn to b4, a big and powerful move, sacrificing a second pawn so that after pawn takes b4, which happens in the game, we get rook c1. Another piece develops, and this queen on c7 and bishop on c6 are in a lot of trouble. A big idea is moving this knight so that the bishop can come out and pin the bishop on c6. Kasparov tries knight g to e7, developing a piece. It makes a ton of sense. Queen b3. We talked earlier about how this pawn f6 move opened this diagonal right here. Now this comes to matter. If black captures, which of course is a terrible idea, capturing into a discovered check right here, there is a finish with knight takes e5 check. Of course, the queen is giving check, and if the king moves back, you have knight to f7 check. Now, a pattern might be appearing to you in this position, but the one way that white could actually lose this in like a bullet game or something is trying to pre-move smothered mate, because you don't actually have smothered mate, because after queen g8 check, the knight takes and f7 is defended twice. That would be a hilarious way for someone to lose this in a blitz game, and there have been a number of cases where someone has made such a mistake. But of course, you don't have to do that. Knight to g5 check, and then knight e6 is a nice fork. This is just one way to finish off and win the game. So after queen b3, Kasparov cannot find a move. He plays pawn to h6, a move that is just very, very sad. It contributes nothing to the defense, and it allows So to develop his last rook, but there was nothing better. At this point, it's a great idea just to pause your video to appreciate the power of So's position. The rooks, 2 open files in the position. He has a rook on either one. The queen, preventing the king from castling. All of the minor pieces in play. Meanwhile, Kasparov's king is still on its starting square. His rooks are on their starting squares. The knight is back on c8. And of the pieces that are developed, none of them are on a good square. None of them are coordinated. This position is +4 according to the engine, and it should come as no surprise to you that white is just totally winning. But of course, it's easy to say that. You still need to play brilliantly to finish any great player off here, to say nothing of Kasparov. At this point, after rook d1, we get pawn to b5. So, in this position, it turns out that So was already planning to sacrifice a knight, so he wasted no more than a couple of seconds to play, boom, knight takes e5. The point is that after pawn takes e5, we have bishop takes b5. The last move, pawn to b5, only egged him on because now he gets to play the sacrifice that creates a massive, massive pin, and he gets to win the pawn on b5. So, in this position, there's just no good move. Kasparov tries a reasonable one, rook to b8, trying to get So to exchange on c6, but instead we get bishop to a4. I love the patience of this move, just keeping up the pressure, and So spent only a couple of seconds on it. He only spent a few minutes for this entire game. After bishop a4, we see here that you cannot capture on a4 because although you are attacking the queen for a moment, so rook takes c7 doesn't work, after queen takes a4 check, the king and the queen are under attack, and the queen will fall on the next move. So bishop a4, queen over to b7, and now rook takes c6. Boom! This move is so nasty. After rook takes c6, we see knight takes c6. There's, of course, nothing else in the position. And then queen into e6 check. This is a monster square for the queen. One very, very pretty continuation here is king f8. Now white can do many things, but the prettiest is absolutely rook to d8 check, mate in 2 because of knight takes, and queen e8 checkmate. A checkmate that I've just never seen in all my years of chess. So, after queen e6 check, the knight goes to e7, bishop to c5. This move creates a situation where both knights are pinned, both bishop takes c6 check is a threat because then black could only capture back with the queen and then this would be mate, and bishop takes e7 and then the capture on c6 is also a threat. There's simply no defense to both of these massive threats. Kasparov plays rook c8 and So simply captures on e7. It is move 25 and Kasparov resigns, making this a miniature, which is what happens when a game is won in just 25 moves. In fact, it's just checkmate in 4. You're not just winning material because after bishop takes e7, queen takes c8 check, king f7, there is bishop to b3 check, and the knight falls, and it's going to be checkmate after the queen blocks, and you capture the queen. This is an absolutely incredible game from So, and it was played in the Ultimate Blitz tournament in St. Louis in 2016. So the broadcast still exists, and you can see Yasser Seirawan, Maurice Ashley, and Jen Shahadi watching this game live. It's absolutely incredible seeing them parse through it, and I'm going to drop a link to that. The examples here of development was So playing excellently, developing all of his pieces, then sacrificing to put his development advantage to good use, with him playing pawn sacrifices to open the position so that his development advantage mattered, and the mistakes from Kasparov, subtle ones and then larger ones, where he's neglecting development in different ways, first developing the queen side and not prioritizing getting castled, and then creating this situation where his bishop on g7, knight on g8, never get into the game. This is all so instructive. It's incredible seeing a game like this played against anyone, but against Kasparov, it's an absolute miracle. If you want to see more games like this, of course, follow the channel, and we will be continuing with more of 100+ modern masterpieces guaranteed to improve your chess.